Hi, I'm Alessandra Gorla, Assistant Research Professor at the India Software Institute in Madrid. In this talk, I'm going to present the risk of automatically granted permission in Android apps. We know that the release cycle in mobile apps is very fast, in the order of days or weeks, because developers want to push new features and they want to keep up with the competitors. As users, we may wonder, though, did something change under the hood between one release and another? This question is particularly relevant because developers can push a new release on the Google Play Store, and by default, this new release will be pushed to the devices of the final users without any approval, unless there are major changes in the app. Now, what are these major changes that would require for an explicit approval of the users? Originally, the Android system used to request permission to the user to install a new version of the app whenever there was any change in the list of permissions. This model had many limitations and has been criticized by the research community, among other things, for its usability. With Android 6, the permission model moved to a dynamic, the permission system moved to a dynamic model. What you see on the right-hand side of the screen is what we are used now as Android users. That is, an app requests for a permission upon its first use. Beside this change, Android 6 introduced the concept of permission groups. This implies that if an app already has a permission group, it can add another permission in the same group in a new release, and the system would grant it automatically without asking the user. For instance, if the application already had the permission to read the calendar, then it can suddenly request the permission to write on the calendar, and the Android system would grant this permission automatically because it belongs to the same group of the read calendar. To give a concrete example, we took an existing birthday app that reminds the user of birthdays of the contacts. It is thus expected that this application requests the access to the list of contacts, as it indeed does in the first release, because it is obviously needed for its functionality. However, we simulate a malicious developer who wants to collect sensitive data of users without being noticed by the user, and we produce a new release of the app asking the permission to access the list of the user's account. And this permission would be granted automatically because it belongs to the same group of the read contact permission. With this permission, the app can now collect sensitive data that the user never explicitly approved to share. So the question we investigate in this work is, do apps abuse of this new permission model in Android? And in the sense that apps may initially ask for some permissions and later ask for new, more invasive permissions and collect sensitive data without users' approval. In order to answer this question, we use two datasets. Android Zoo, that is maintained by the University of Luxembourg, and APK Pure, that is an alternative store for Android applications that keeps several releases of the same apps. We analyzed the manifest files of almost 3 million apps of Android Zoo and over 200,000 apps on APK Pure. And we compared the declared permissions among each subsequent pair of releases to answer the first research question. That is, do apps ask for permissions that are automatically granted? How prevalent is this practice? We found 63,000 and almost 3,000 samples of APKs with automatically granted permissions. These may seem low numbers, but if we look at the number of these numbers per application, we see that actually 7% of the apps in Android Zoo have at least one release with at least one automatically granted permission. This number is even higher in APK Pure, it's 17%. We plot this data to see what types of permissions are automatically granted and what are the enabler permissions. This is the overview of the results of our analysis on the two datasets. Now, before getting into some considerations, let me explain how to read this plot. On the left-hand side, we report the enabler permissions, that is, the permission that appeared already in a previous release. On the right-hand side, the automatically granted permission. So, for instance, we found 3,789 apps that can suddenly write to external storage while they initially only ask for the read permission. Or we found 1,353 apps that obtain the permission to write contacts. Roughly half of the time, this permission is automatically granted because the app already had the permission to read the list of contacts. And the other half of the times, because it already had the permission to access the accounts of the user. Now back to the results, we conclude that this practice is actually quite prevalent. There are many permissions on the right-hand side that are granted automatically without any consent. Over 50% of the automatically granted permissions allow apps to access sensitive data such as the list of contacts, the list of phone calls, or the precise user's location. Over 40% of the automatically granted permissions allow apps to make phone calls or allow write operations on protected resources. Now, we know that this practice is quite prevalent. So now what we care about is to understand if apps actually use these permissions or they just request them without then really using it. To answer this question, we statically analyze the sample that we identified in the first research question. Specifically, we create the call graph of the APK, of each APK, with defined entry points. And we look for any use of the permission that is supposed to be automatically granted. If this is reachable from any entry point, then we mark it as confirmed, as in this case. If instead we find a use in the code, but this code does not look reachable, then we mark it as unconfirmed. Finally, if we do not find any use at all of this permission in the code, we mark it as unused. So here we plot the results divided by permission and divided by our classification. We confirm that apps actually use at least 56% of the automatically granted permissions. Accurate users' location, phone numbers, and SMS are the most confirmed uses, with a frequency of at least 70% of the cases. Now, we know that more than half of the permissions that are automatically granted are actually used by the application. The final question that we are interested in is, how do apps use this information? And to answer this last research question, we resort to manual analysis. So we manually explore instrumenting the app, running it, and tracing the network traffic from the device. We did this work for roughly 400 samples that we randomly selected. And then we manually inspected the cases that looked more interesting and suspicious. We observed several sensitive data leaks. Roughly 12% of the apps leak information about the location of the user, and 1% leak the email, that is the identifier of the device. This information is sent most of the time to app-owned domains, in 64% of the cases, and to third-party domains in the remaining cases. By analyzing the descriptions and of these apps, we discovered that none of the apps that leak data would need the information that they are gathering. To conclude, we would like to present a couple of interesting case studies. The first one is a smart keyboard for to efficiently provide input. This app initially asks for the read phone state permission, and it does so in order to hide the keyboard when a call is received. So later in time, it requests the permission to access the code log of the user. And this permission is automatically granted because it belongs to the same group of the read phone state. We confirm that the app actually accesses the list of phone calls on the device, leaks this information to a Chinese server upon starting a new activity. The activity, however, is not directly reachable from the main activity, and it has to be explicitly invoked with an intent. However, this behavior can be triggered. This behavior is highly suspicious, and basically we could not find any explanation of why such an application would do this. Another example is CodeBlock. This app is supposed to block phone calls of undesired contacts. So because of this reason, it requires in the first, since the first release, the permission to read the list of contacts. And intuitively, well, the user understands that this information is needed and it grants this permission. However, later in time, in a new release, the application requires the permission to get access to the accounts of the user. And with this newly acquired permission, the app collects emails of specific domains like Gmail and Hotmail from the accounts, encrypts them, and sends this information to their server as background task that is triggered from the main screen. And no functionality of this app could justify actually this behavior. So in this talk, to conclude, we presented the problem of automatically granted permission in Android apps. We saw that the old permission model cared more about privacy rather than usability, and it had several issues. However, the new model is too much in favor of usability and leaves space for privacy issues, as we show in this work. So what we hope for the future is to find the right balance between these two important properties.